See, Susan Mulligan was in the overflow room, so we're going to make sure we grab her, bring her in, and Julian's here.
Yeah. Yeah, hi, nice to meet you.
And I think that those remarks are going to be really helpful in providing some foundational work for some additional thinking and discussion that we can have later today and can inform the remarks of our subsequent speakers and panelists. I'll point out that the papers were in your packets for those in the audience, and for those in our virtual audience, they certainly are online at our website, newamerica.net, so please find them there. We're going to turn our attention now. Let's see. Susan, come right up. Make yourself at home here. We're going to turn our attention now to the intersection of political culture and politics with a panel discussion entitled Political Institutions and Elections in the Next Political Era. We've got three insightful panelists to comment on this. They're going to speak for about 7 or 8 minutes and then take your questions. Their full bios are in your packets, but I'll introduce them briefly now. Mark Schmidt's my colleague here at the New America Foundation. He's a senior fellow here, and he's also a columnist for the American Prospect. Julian Zelizer is a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University. He's written a lot of academic and also in the popular media on Congress and political reform. And Susan Milligan is a political reporter for the Boston Globe in their Washington Bureau, and she's an influential commentator and writer as well. So without further ado, Mark.
Thank you, Reed. Thank you all for coming today. I'm glad you all could be here. I'm glad to have this panel. This is a little bit my own fantasy panel of people who I think I've kind of learned the most from about Congress and the political structures in the last couple of years. Julian's book on Capitol Hill really helped me understand a lot. I've worked in Congress for 7 years, but really helped me understand a lot about the historical evolution and where things were headed. And Susan's a lot of her work, but particularly a set of articles she did about the House of Representatives in 2004 was very influential on my thinking. My thought in this panel was to sort of get away a little bit from the questions about public opinion and move into the questions of the institutions of government, parties, Congress, elections, and the questions, the fundamental question of how we're going to govern this country in a new political era. And I think there's no question that to continue Cliff's joke, on this day next year, we will in fact be in a different political era of some significant kind. It may simply be, as Phil has put it, sort of the post-Rovian era, the last roughly 5-6 years roughly since about September 11th or the beginning of the Bush administration through the 2006 election were a kind of singularity, I think, in American politics, a very unique period where kind of all the normal rules went out the window a little bit, with the actual attempt at one-party control of government, something which is usually considered an unwise move, and I think in fact turned out to be, and which was very profoundly disruptive and confusing to a lot of people's attempts to understand government through traditional models like the median voter model that says that that parties do tend to move towards the center. And New America fellow Jacob Hacker's book with Paul Pearson called Off Center, I think captured some of that. Some of the uniqueness of that particular era and the kind of apocalyptic politics of which in some ways we're still dealing with when you look at the kind of showdown over the FISA reauthorization, for example. But we're in a kind of middle period between the end of that period and something that's going to come. The something that's going to come could merely be the end of this particular small 5-year cycle, or it could be that this last 5-6 years was kind of the decadent late stage of the 30-year conservative era, which began, roughly 1978-79 with the introduction of the Kemp-Roth tax cuts, which at the time were, totally radical move. And the attacks on the Panama Canal Treaty and some of the real emergence of conservatism as a governing philosophy at that time. It could be one, or it could be it could be merely the short era that ends, or it could be the long era that ends. I often use the analogy from this era to using an analogy that maybe complicates things because the analogy is more complicated than the underlying thing. But it's kind of like a hedge fund or a financial move that kind of tries to corner a market and blows up. Like long-term capital management in the 90s or something like that. Sometimes when things like that happen, the firm collapses, people go bankrupt, but the underlying structure remains the same. Sometimes when things like that happen, everything changes, and there's no returning to the normal functioning of the system. Whole new structures have to be created, obviously, as in, for example, the New Deal period. And possibly in financial markets right now as well. So the question is, how, what are you going to come back to? I can't imagine going back to the normal way we governed this country, in the 80s and 90s. I worked on Capitol Hill in the 1990s. I worked for a member of the Senate Finance Committee, and my model of how we governed this country was always, was based on sitting behind that dais of the Senate Finance Committee and watching, Democratic senators who were more conservative, like Senator Boren or Senator Benson, negotiating with their Republican colleagues who were more liberal than they were, Senator Chafee, Senator Durenberger, Senator Danforth, and so forth. And that was it was aesthetically very pleasing. It was a good model for governing. It was kind of fascinating to watch, and they had they had all that senatorial attitude and a commitment to making the country better. It also stopped working. I mean, there are very few real successes for that model of government. Kind of the last gasp of it was the attempt to salvage something out of healthcare in 1994. But it was pleasing to watch. We're not going back to that, and I think a lot of people's reactions to the partisanship of the current era has been a kind of nostalgia. And my question is, how do we move forward without that nostalgia? The consequences of the short political era are that it finalized the kind of great sorting out of parties and ideology that had been going on for close to 50 years, so that we now have a Democratic Party which is fundamentally liberal, progressive, and non-Southern, and a Republican Party which is fundamentally conservative and has a base in the South. And that one step in that direction was in 1994 when the Southern Democrats were wiped out. The second step was in 2006 when a lot of the Northern Republicans were wiped out. So that we're now in that position. And the other element of it was that there was an unprecedented move towards partisanship on the part of Democrats. The Pew poll that came out yesterday has Democratic identification at 38%, significant levels of engagement and loyalty and participation, as shown by the turnout in the primaries. I noticed in Wisconsin the loser in the Democratic primary got twice as many votes as the winner of the Republican primary. And so this is this development of partisanship on both sides is a significant development. Partly insignificant because the Democratic Party in the old days didn't actually offer. There wasn't reason to be a member of the Democratic Party, which included plenty of people that you disagreed with, whether you were a conservative or a liberal. So that people did their politics through interest groups and single issue groups and so forth, which had a tendency to widen things out. I think it's possible. I think what's interesting to me is that there's a lot of positive aspects to that kind of partisanship and bringing people together around a broad shared set of values, as opposed to doing it through narrow interest group politics. And I don't see that as an unhealthy development. And I think it was Julian's book that first really got me interested in the quest by political scientists in the 1950s for what they called responsible parties, and the idea that parties that were identified with a national program would would be a healthy development for this country rather than the kind of cobbling together of things. But I think it leaves the question, how do we govern this country? Because it won't be the old way. And I guess all I would leave by suggesting, since I've already been called on time, what I would leave by suggesting is that, that we look at what I've been reading with fascination, the liberal encomiums to William F. Buckley. And I was at a conference at the American Enterprise Institute yesterday, and the only person who mentioned William F. Buckley was E.J. Dionne. You know, and it really is fascinating to read the approach to Buckley, and it makes me think that what we need to govern this country is a way in which liberalism can actually engage with an honest and straightforward conservatism, so that instead of kind of a Democrat looking for the Republican who agrees with him, like, you know, Senator Chafee, which is a little bit kind of, I think, Senator Clinton's model of bipartisanship. You look for how are you going to work together with people who don't agree with you, and actually be straightforward about your values, where they're coming from, their values, where they're coming from. And I think that's a little bit modeled in Senator Obama's approach, which is, it's in a sense, it's not more bipartisan, it's not post-partisan, but it's a different approach to how you begin that conversation if you look at his book and so forth. But I think it's really modeled, I think, on, you know, maybe the love of Buckley was just his, you know, personal style and personal grace and so forth. But I think a lot of it was a kind of honest, engaged conservatism that can meet an honest, engaged liberalism on the other side and figure out a way to move forward. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to just talk about 3 questions where I think we see that there might be more continuity after 2008 than public opinion even might suggest, because of institutions and broader changes that are still in place since the 1970s. The first is this question: is conservatism dead? Is the Reagan coalition, has it fractured? And I think sometimes when we hear that argument, commentators make the same argument that conservatives made in the 1970s, that liberalism would just go away. But what they discovered was that liberalism was entrenched in American public policy and American institutions and American public opinion, and part of the history of conservatism since the 70s has been coming to terms with that, once conservatives were in power. And I think liberals will have to, or post-partisans, it's an interesting term, will have to deal with the same thing. Part of the conservative revolution was more than just Ronald Reagan, more than Newt Gingrich. It was a bigger institutional and organizational shift that took place. We saw conservatives really learn the ways and means of Capitol Hill after the 1970s, both as a majority and a minority, as we've seen in the last 2 years, and learn to be extremely effective at using the post-Watergate mechanisms of the legislative process to either achieve new kinds of legislation, like the tax cuts in 2001, the repeal of the state tax, or to defend the status quo. And I think that's important. We saw a revolution in the world of think tanks, where we're in right now, in universities, where conservatives committed themselves to the production of ideas and have left behind a very vibrant world that's still very much there and will continue to be a powerful force in years to come. Conservatives also devoted themselves to new media outlets. The first we saw was the creation of talk radio shows in the 1980s and 90s with the Rush Limbaughs and others kind of popping up and allowing some of these ideas to have a very strong public forum. And we had the creation of Fox Television, which is now a prime media outlet, competing with CNN and other channels. And another area where we saw conservatism kind of undertake an organizational revolution was with the now infamous K Street Project. And the links between the Republican Party and the lobbying community. Now, that's obviously been somewhat discredited with the Jack Abramoff scandals and Democratic takeover of Congress, but the relationships are still there. And I think a lot of the achievements of conservatism in forging those links here in Washington remain very much in place. In the courts, we saw a revolution of kind of changing the governing philosophy of the courts and the justices since the 1970s. And finally, on this issue, conservatives, like liberals in the 30s and 40s, achieved certain policy victories that will last. The tax cuts that we've had since 1981 combined with the failure of Social Security and Medicare reform, leave us in something of a fiscal straitjacket. That will be a sobering reality check to liberals, conservatives, post-partisans, progressives, or whoever's in the White House come 2008. But it will be one of the inheritances we have of the conservative movement. Second question, is polarization going away? Partisanship, polarization. Still hard to see. I hear the public opinion, and I think the public might be different than the political process. You know, we've had certain broad changes since the 70s, demographic and institutional, that fueled the partisanship we've had. It's not simply a creation of Karl Rove. This is a product of changes that have been taking place since the 1970s. We had changes in the political process, still very much with us, that foster a certain level of polarization in congressional politics, in primary politics. In Congress, for example, we had the breakup of the committee system and the gradual strengthening of party mechanisms, which both Democrats and Republicans have enjoyed. And the way that Congress is still organized really facilitates strong partisanship, whether you're in the minority or the minority, or the majority. The primary system that we're seeing right now, I still think it lends itself to the involvement of activists overall, who tend to be on the extreme spectrums of either party. And it's unclear that the primary system is real, that came up with George McGovern and then Ronald Reagan benefited from in '76, is really going to change. And we also had a demographic change, which is still evident in that both parties lost their center. So Southerners became Republican and Northeasterners all became Democrat, just about. So there are not many centrist voters still in either party, and we heard earlier about diminishing identification as an independent and rising levels of identification as liberals and conservatives. And there's other changes, the 24-hour media and the internet, I think, fuel a certain kind of polarization in our political dialogue. Finally, is there some kind of new progressivism or economic populism, is another way to think about it, that's on the horizon? We hear a lot of that with Ohio and with the Texas primaries, and everyone's trying to look like you know, William Jennings Bryan or Huey Long all of a sudden. There is some indication, obviously, economic issues are a growing concern. Democrats are seeing incentives to focus on that. But there, too, I think there's some big challenges. Democrats who have used this language and these ideas, they've fallen flat. We saw Walter Mondale try to use this in 1984. Didn't work so well. Michael Dukakis turned to it toward the end of his campaign in his run against George Bush I. Al Gore, most recently John Edwards, have had trouble kind of selling this message in different economic times. So I think if there is going to be a new kind of economic progressivism or economic populism, Democrats need to deal with a couple challenges that they faced in using this language. The first is that Democrats are no longer a working-class rural party. A great part of their electorate are now middle-class Americans, suburban middle-class Americans whose economic anxieties revolve around mortgage burdens, professional job insecurity and retraining needs, health care costs, retirement issues. And this is not to discredit the idea that economic issues should matter, but they need to be readjusted. You can't tap into the language of, sorry to the cameras, you can't tap back into the language of the 1930s or the 1890s without readjusting the kind of specific issues that these voters face. A second challenge for Democrats is, you know, we're still in an era, Democrats are still in the Bill Clinton era of the era of big government is over. And the public opinion was interesting in that that's still very much with younger Americans true. A kind of a belief in markets over government and a resistance to bigness. And so I think Democrats need to square, how can you have an economic populism or an economic progressivism with this other philosophy that is counter to what that tradition was about the use of government as a form of intervention. And finally, they have to deal with the age-old problem of the populist and progressive rhetoric is of raising expectations, making vague promises, and then once in office not really being able to achieve those kinds of means. So I guess I step here a little bit as the historian, saying conservatism won't certainly die a quick death. Don't know if it's a comeback, but it's certainly very much part of our political fabric. Polarization and partisanship clearly have a lot of push behind them still, even if there's changes in public opinion and candidates are trying to break free from it. And economic populism and progressivism has a tough struggle ahead. So we can see change and continuity very much at work in 2008, and that's actually what the next president, Republican or Democrat, is going to have to deal with and work with. Thank you.
Okay, I won't knock it over. I think when we talk about post-partisan America, we need to talk about how we define partisanship now. And I don't think it actually, at least on the Hill, has anything to do with the liberal and conservative construct. I mean, I've watched this Republican majority, well, previous Republican majority, come into power, and let's see, they created an entirely new federal agency, an entirely new entitlement program. They have instituted an unprecedented federal involvement in elementary and secondary education, and drove up the debt and the deficit. So I'm not sure where the conservative principles are there, so I don't think this is an issue of just, you know, sort of competing ideologies. It had more to do with the power struggle. I think it's important to look at the history of this and you know, why it became as bad as it did at the time. And I think it's part of it is a function of how closely divided it was. I mean, you hear people on the Hill talk about the grand old days when Pete Domenici and Orrin Hatch and Bob Byrd would fight over the budget, and then they'd sit down and break out the bottle of Merlot and they'd all work it out, and that's true, and there is a longing for those days. But it was easier to do that when one party had a pretty strong majority. And part of the issue, part of the problem in the mid-1990s is things were so closely divided that they couldn't do what they used to do in the past, which is to throw the minority a few bones. I mean, there was, for the longest period of time, people were very, very comfortable in their roles in the minority. I mean, they just, they just kind of, you know, had the same, you know, foot track in and out of the chamber, and they knew what their role was, and the majority wasn't so threatened by the minority. This was not true in the 1990s. So they had this unusual party discipline in the Republican Party on the Hill, and some of that was driven by personalities, by Tom DeLay and working in tandem with Karl Rove. They had, as I've written about, they you know, use the Rules Committee to sort of squelch any kind of, you know, Democratic initiative. They'd have so-called emergency meetings of the Rules Committee literally in the middle of the night and shove a bill down their throats the next morning. And some of this was a function of the personalities, but I think they also did it because they had such a narrow majority and they really had to keep them in line. The second thing that happened is that then some of those people started moving over to the Senate. Now, the Senate, as we all know who've read Master of the Senate, is the institution that is the saucer which cools the hot tea of the House of Representatives. But when you get all these former House people in there are used to getting their own way, they don't really adjust to that very well. And the way that I think about that best is being a Buffalonian and growing up in a football town and without a baseball team. And I'm used to football, and I'm used to 4 quarters that are 15 minutes and enemy territory and penalties, and everything is very rigid and very, you know, specific and very ordered. And it's very hard for me to understand baseball with, you know, 7th inning stretches, and sometimes they have extra innings, and they stop and they go over and they talk to each other, and I'm like, you know, and I can't watch it. I just can't constitutionally watch it. So when you get these House members who go over to the Senate, I mean, they really aren't used to it, and then they try to sort of impose a House way of doing things on the Senate by trying to get rid of the filibuster for judicial nominations and so forth. Although something tells me that after the election this year, they might be rethinking that idea of not having the filibuster for judicial nominations. And they tried to sort of put this kind of House-style rule on the Senate with some success in the way they ran things. There were some rules that they couldn't get rid of. So I think that was part of what was driving this. But what's happening now, and what I'm actually really excited about, is I feel like the electorate is starting to take the process back, and I think we're seeing some of this in this election. You look at the Republican side, John McCain and Mike Huckabee are the last people that the Republican establishment wants. They didn't create them, they can't control them, they don't know what they're going to do. Mike Huckabee's talking about poor people, John McCain's talking about campaign finance reform, and they're used to kind of picking picking the candidate and shoving it down the throats of the electorate. And this year, the electorate basically said, no, 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 you know what, we're going to tell you who the nominee is. And I think that that's very telling that they were so successful in doing that. I mean, any academic teaching political science would be the first one to say, well, in this day and age, the person who ends up getting the nomination is going to be the guy with the anchorman good looks and the deep voice and pots of his own money. And, well, Mitt Romney got out of the campaign before Mike Huckabee has. So there's something going on there. And on the Democratic side as well, I mean, all accounts would have told us that Hillary Clinton would have run away with this. She had the structure behind her. She had the Democratic machine behind her, or at least the Clinton machine from 1992. She certainly had the money. She hired all of the consultants that she needed to hire. She actually had 10 different types of consultants as of even last summer, like before they even really got into the swing of the campaign. And on paper, it looks like this is the person who would get the nomination, and then you get somebody who's come more or less out of nowhere with less Senate experience, talking about hope, and he's touching a nerve in a lot of people. And I do think actually that it's very telling that in Iowa, that the candidates who won in each party were the candidates talking about hope and reconciliation. And whether they'll be able to do that, I mean, clearly Huckabee's not going to get the nomination, but whether they'd succeed in doing that, I don't know. But I think that it's interesting that that's what the electorate responded to. There's one thing that I pick up around the country, from California to New Hampshire, is that people are just physically and emotionally exhausted with this red state, blue state thing. I don't think it's that liberals are thinking, oh, I don't know, maybe this is too extreme, maybe we need to find a third way. Or I think this isn't even about the Democratic Leadership Council or third way or moderate Republicans. They're just exhausted. They're just tired of people telling them to fight. And so when you have John Edwards getting up there, delivering a message I think would have been more powerful, and even 06 saying, I'm going to fight, and I'm going to fight again, I'm going to fight for you, people are just like, I just don't want to fight anymore. They're just tired of it. They can't sustain it anymore. And you see talk radio and you see the internet trying to keep this going for, there are people who make a great deal of money and, stay kind of in the public eye by just being very aggressive and very extreme. But I just think that the electorate isn't responding to it anymore. And I think it's also telling that we're seeing a turnout this year that's just unprecedented. And while it is true that party activists tend to drive a lot of these primaries, particularly, of course, the caucuses, I mean, the turnout in Nevada was 10 times in the Democratic Party what it was in '04, which is really, really stunning. It was still fairly small, but they have their own demographic issues out there. And the Republicans are not growing their turnout as much as the Democrats, but they're still have an unprecedented turnout. So I'm getting the impression that the electorate this year is starting to take the process back and rejecting the whole red state, blue state, liberal conservative, dichotomy, and nominating people who are not necessarily what the party establishment would want. And finally, I think we need to keep an eye on the growth of independent voters. It is true that they are not truly independent, that they do tend to vote with one party or another, and the recent numbers have shown they're voting more heavily Democratic. But the fact that they're rejecting the party label at all, I think, is pretty dramatic when you consider how entrenched the two-party system is here. I actually think, in Colorado right now, independents are actually a plurality of the voters, and I think they're going to be the critical vote in November. They may not be the plurality of the national vote, but I think they're going to be the determinant vote. And I think, especially if it is an Obama-McCain ticket, that they're up for grabs. They both pull independent voters, and I think that is going to be the defining thing. So I'm excited this year. As I said, I think that the electorate's finally taking their system back. They're taking the campaigns back. I think it's going to take a number of cycles before they're really back in control. But I do think that we've seen a tipping point, and that'll be the beginning of the post-partisan era.
Thank you. We'll take some questions now from the floor. We have an optimist and a pessimist on the panel, and maybe Mark is in between. Yes, in the back. And you can speak up and tell us who you are.
Al Milliken, Washington Independent Writers. I was curious how you see the political institutions, politicians dealing with Medicare and Social Security in the next few years.
Is this on? Well, I think a lot of it is just going to be driven by the sheer cost of it. It's going to make it more difficult for them to have some sort of philosophical argument about it because, of the baby boomers retiring and so forth. And I do think that is one of those issues that isn't going to come down to a partisan or ideological fight because it simply can't.
I mean, but it is a good test of, it will be a good test of if we have some concrete change in governing structures, because that is a kind of, it's a big issue. It affects both parties, and it affects a broad portion of the population. And both parties have fallen flat in dealing with it. So kind of that's where we can move from the promises of the campaign to the realities of Capitol Hill, and we can see how much leg post-partisanship will have.
I would just add, part of being involved in this next social contract project here has been the idea that, we're kind of put together a broad picture of domestic policy and health care and pensions and so forth. And every once in a while, I'm enthusiastic about that, and then every once in a while I turn around and say, it's really all health care. and sometimes it really is all health care. And health care is going to be a major, major test of how we govern the country. And it will be, clearly the deficit crisis is a healthcare crisis, the healthcare cost inflation crisis, and if we're able to bring in the real cost controls that are less talked about than the coverage expansions, the rest will fall into place. Social Security will probably be a lower priority for any future president. McCain's approach is essentially to talk about entitlements as a broad category, and it'll be an interesting political test when you. What often happens when that's done is the Democrats say, okay, well let's start voting on these entitlements one by one. Let's start with veterans. Let's start with this, and quickly that concept falls apart.
As a reporter on immigration issues, I've been very interested in watching the power of the blue dogs, and I never hear people talk about them, but as we know, the philosophy of the 2006 election by Rahm Emanuel is to whistle past Dixie, more or less, to leave the South behind. But to do that, the Democrats could win without the South, but to do that, they had to get the mountain states, and that meant the blue dogs. And I think we had 24 blue pups, as they call them, this year. And now some of them become very strong on the proposing immigration stuff, but they are conservative Democrats, at least fiscally conservative Democrats, and on some social issues. So I'm wondering if you've been following them. I think they have a lot of power. And in the Senate, too. I mean, Webb and Tester and all of those guys, they're the new kind of blue dog senators.
Well, I've always just been baffled why for so long the Democrats kept hanging on to the South like it's Tara and their Scarlett O'Hara, and they can't let it go. And they don't understand that, like, the relationship's over. You want to say, stop drunk dialing Louisiana, quit stalking Arkansas. They left you. And because they had it at one point, and it's not just about, they want to shake people and say, why don't you like us anymore? But it's demographic changes, and what's happening in the Mountain West isn't so much that people are saying, I think maybe I want to be a Democrat. It's that, you have New Yorkers moving out to Las Vegas. The demographics of those states are changing, and that's why the politics are changing for the most part. Although you do have some Republicans out west who are, sort of more libertarian Republicans who don't like some of the things that the administration has done, so that's driving it a little bit. But it's mostly demographics, and I think that they've gotten a little bit smarter recently about picking candidates, particularly on the House side, that are more reflective of the states that they're running in than, what the Democratic leadership in Washington thinks that they should be. And I think that's one of the reasons they were successful in '06. I mean, they can't abandon the South completely. I mean, I think they realized recently that they had one point abandoned the West and abandoned other parts of the country, and they could, they picked up a Kansas seat. They almost picked up that Wyoming seat last time. So I think that they can't abandon it, but I think they're finally realizing that you just can't keep trying to take the old model of when you had a big majority back in the 70s or 80s.
If I can add one thing to that, I think it's important to remember that what we call blue dog Democrats now are a lot more liberal than what were blue dog Democrats even 15 years ago. I mean, when Bill Clinton was Bill Clinton's first 2 years, Richard Shelby was a Democrat. He becomes a Republican, immediately becomes one of the most conservative Republicans. Billy Towson of Louisiana was a Democrat at that time. So, it's a lot easier to work out an accommodation with a Webb or a Tester or a Heath Schuler, where there's a basic shared values than there was in that old unmanageable coalition.
I wanted to ask Susan to elaborate a little bit. She talked about the electorate sort of taking back the system. So what does that mean? If in fact you think that the electorate is taking back the system, how do you think the system is going to change at that? Are we going to see a change at a federal level, or are we going to see change at the local level? What are you expecting to see change in the institution, not necessarily in
I think that the changes in the institution aren't going to happen until you have a change in some of the personalities, and I think it may take a while, especially if the Republicans end up not having the White House and in the minority. They're going to really, you know, band together and try to regroup, and they may end up being more partisan just to stay alive, which I think either party would do. I don't think it's a function of being a Republican. But I do think there'd be a different tone with some of the people who are running now if they got into office than there has been, because it's just so. I mean, they go in there now, and their mission is basically to knock down the other side. It's just sort of the Sharks versus the Jets. It's not even about policy anymore, and I do think that might change. I think the public is tired of it, and you know, look, there are people. I mean, who made that mistake? Mitt Romney. It's amazing to me that he didn't come out and say, you know, I was a red governor in the bluest state out there, and we did stuff, and we did this proposal on health care, and it's pretty bold, and we'll see how it works, but I can do that with one of the most liberal legislatures in the country. I can deal with Congress. Instead, he just played to the right wing and, you know, flipped his positions on certain social issues, but he lost. I mean, that didn't work. So I do think that that's a sign that in both parties that people are tired of that sort of headbutting. But I think it's going to take a while to play itself out. I don't think that the institutions were permanently damaged by what's happened in the past, you know, 8 or 10 years, though.
It'll have to play out somehow, though, in congressional elections. I mean, if the midterms continue to have pretty high rates of incumbency, you're going to have the same phenomenon in Congress in terms of what their issues are. And if it's Barack Obama and John McCain, you know, they're going to play to a very similar Republican Party. So there's a certain test on the electorate after the primary and election's over, because we've had declining trust in government, we've had continued frustration in government for over three decades, and there have been elections where this same issue has come up, and there's a lot of promises of post-partisanship, whatever term it's used, and then it falls apart. So, you know, I think there's something on the electorate playing this out in some other kind of mechanism, namely midterms, if it's going to be viable. Because if not, everything will fall back in place quite easily.
And actually, I'd like to ask you as the historian to comment on something which is, it's often been said that Americans prefer divided government in some respects at times. And what if we end up with a unified government with the election? What can we learn from past experiences, and what do you think that would have an impact on reform efforts?
Well, I mean, the one model of unified government is obviously you go to the 1930s and 60s and you have incredible legislative, you know, production and, you know, real changes in what government does and what kind of programs we do. But the other model is Clinton's first term, where we seem to have very little come out of Washington. And you find that the White House and a partisan Congress, or, you know, they can be at loggerheads. And you know, with I think Bush 1, the record is still unclear. I mean, in some ways, the Bush administration did not achieve, as you outlined, what the promise of conservatism was at all. And we have to define what conservatism can be. So unified government, tight partisan control does not mean legislative productivity anymore. And because the minority is pretty ideologically homogeneous and has tools they can use, they can block, I think, legislation pretty easily, as we're seeing, you know, we've seen repeatedly.
Yes. At the end of his comments, Mr. Zuckin used one phrase that I kind of jumped at it. He made a comment that he thought the millennials would be worse civically. And without getting hung up on the verb, how do you think they're going to play it? I think they're ahead of the curve in terms of the institution. Sort of the Congress and political things are going to lag that. But how is the ethos of these millennials, social networks, not MySpace or Facebook, but how they work together, how they work as teams and are more entrepreneurial? What is that mess going to turn into in terms of the political institutions?
And I think also that part of that claim was based on the fact that we were observing, you know, lower voting patterns and lower rates of kind of interest in current events. And
my sense is they're going to behave different politically than the institutions we're used to. That's why I reacted to the word worse. But I'm just wondering if you have a perspective on that.
I don't know. It seems their values are at odds with the debates we still have, which are very much rooted in the 60s and 70s. You know, they not only have new ideas, they have new mechanisms of political communication and participation. They're still not I don't know what their numbers are. And so how much political pressure they can exert and what their interest in really participating over long periods of time is. That's the problem. I mean, will they wake up and not just vote, but, you know, stay up and continue to participate? But if they do, I mean, that's where there is promise. That's a generational change we've seen before. We're living with the generational change from the 70s. So that might be ultimately what we need to break into a new era.
I mean, actually, young people have their voter participation has grown dramatically. In fact, they were almost singularly responsible for the increase in turnout from 2000 to 2004, and there was another big increase in 06, and they're expecting this very high this year. And we don't notice it because those of us who were alive in the 60s remember people out in the streets and demonstrating, and they're all text messaging each other and doing things that I don't even know how to do and don't want to do. And that's why you don't notice it. But the Institute of Politics at Harvard has actually done some really fascinating studies on this, and certainly they're responsible for, greatly responsible for Obama's success. He never would have gotten this far without young voters.
And what they have now with the internet is a kind of form of mass communication, which
like a secret code
but it's not through the network. So the 60s protest was still through the networks of the newspapers. Yeah. That's how they got their message out. They don't need that anymore. And so there is a kind of powerful tool of instant communication and distribution that they have now at their disposal.
But, you know, it's interesting what your attitude about politics will be if your formative experience of the public life begins sometime, you know, after the election of George W. Bush, and you see it all in those kind of apocalyptic terms, and you don't have the experience of the other.
Insurgency in a sense, a positive spin as to what terrorist cells are on the negative side.
All kinds of things, and will potentially shape your sense of what's possible in politics. I think generationally, I was very interested in the controversy over Senator Obama's comments about Ronald Reagan. And yet I felt, I'm younger than Barack Obama, but in college, roughly the same time, sort of had the similar, I sort of, like, as a generational thing, that's exactly right. You know, we're all little kids, we think, oh, Ronald Reagan's elected, this is going to be awful, and then you kind of realize it's not awful, it's healthy. There were good ideas that he had. It's a totally different formative experience of politics than what people are going through right now, because that was a much more accommodating and fascinating era.
Okay, one more question.
You mentioned that you feel health care is going to be a big issue. But I talk to a lot of regular people, both parties, and immigration is just bothering the heck out of them. And yet I don't hear it expressed that much because they get labeled as racist and things like that. But I think it's a much bigger undercurrent issue than people are alluding to. And I'd like your opinion.
It's a huge issue.
It's a question about immigration.
But if John McCain is the nominee, which it looks like he's going to be, I think it's going to be in some ways less of an issue in the campaign because, you know, you wouldn't have a Democrat running against somebody who is more hardline on immigration than. I mean, if it were Romney versus, well, not Romney, but Giuliani or somebody, or, well, he had some issues too. But I mean, but McCain, since he was obviously one of the original sponsors of one of the immigration reform bills, I think it's going to be less of a defining issue. But I agree with you; it's an issue for a lot of voters out there. I suspect it'll be more of an issue in some of the congressional campaigns than in the presidential, because of the personalities involved.
But there's such a split in both parties on that issue, and that's what we learned in 2006 and 2007. Even the Democrats, that there's this great incentive not to talk about it, even though the population wants to. So, I mean, that can counter what you're reading in public opinion might not translate. They learned their lesson with the immigration bill. The parties just don't have, either party, neither has a consensus on what to do.
Well, thank you very much. Join me in thanking the panel. Excellent discussion. Thank you.